Okay, for this controlled assessment on Romeo and Juliet, we're looking mainly at one scene, which is very useful. It means you don't have to study that much, Act 2, Scene 5. And the character we're looking at is just the nurse. And these bullet points tell us what we're looking at. The thoughts and feelings of the nurse, well, we'll definitely pick that up just by analysing some quotations. The way the other characters react to them, so in this case it's Juliet. We're going to have to consider her responses, and what makes the relationship between the nurse and the Juliet so important, and that's where we're going to consider the context of the play, so how they drive the plot forward, but also how they would have been received by Shakespeare's audience at the time. So that's quite a demanding task on its own, but now OCR want you to compare the play as it appears on the page to a performed version. And for the purpose of this video, just to keep life easy, we're going to look at the Baz Luhrmann version. Okay, well, what does the A-star look like? Firstly, it's got to be sophisticated. I'll model that for you. You've got to interpret, that's easy. You have to be precise, and that's really got to do with analysing your quotations. And if you have more than one interpretation, you're bound to be sophisticated, so we're going to look at that skill. AO3, however, counts for a little bit more. It's got to be perceptive, as you can see here, and once again that's going to come from analysing your quotations again, so that skill keeps coming up. And we've got to find points of connection between the texts. Well, if we're looking at how the nurse is portrayed, that's an automatic point of connection, so we don't have to worry about that. And then we have to talk about subtlety. And to look at subtlety, we're going to look at Shakespeare's view, what he would have thought, and we'll compare that to a modern audience. Isn't my handwriting disgusting? Well, there you go. So these notes are taken from Schmoop. That's the website address up there, and I'll post it on Edmodo for you. And this writer sees the nurse as essentially a comic character, and so the joy of her relationship with Juliet is in that she's teasing her, and there's that kind of gentle mocking tone. We know what Juliet is waiting for, and we also know that the nurse knows exactly what Romeo's going to do, and the pleasure in the scene is having that that news deferred. So Juliet has to defer her own pleasure here, something which she doesn't willingly do. And in the Luhrmann version, a comedy is very much what's at the forefront of that interpretation. You'll notice that particularly in the way that she complains about her aching back. She takes on an Italian accent, she doesn't finish off her words properly, and she forces Juliet to massage her by complaining how tired she is. And this writer says when Juliet can't stand it anymore, it's almost like some prolonged foreplay before the actual culmination of the news that Romeo is willing to marry her in Friar Lawrence's cell. And again, in the Baz Luhrmann version, you get the feeling that the nurse emphasises Friar Lawrence's cell to suggest that it's possibly a holy wedding. Cliff Notes, the address is up there, and again I'll post this on Edmodo, doesn't see the nurse's role as primarily comic. She's actually there to represent the mother figure, and perhaps this is to look at the class system operating at the time and ask actually what is the proper role of a mother, and why is this being given away to a working class woman, the nurse, instead of Juliet's real mother. The nurse also exists to give us a lot of backstory, or in a play the backstory is called exposition, and so her real job is to keep reminding us of how old Juliet is, and another way of looking at that, of course, is to say how young she is. We might react to this in two different ways. One way to look at it might be the one that this writer takes, and it focuses on the nurse's age, and And the point about the nurse's age is that you've got a contrast between the quickness of love in the young lovers, and we're invited to sympathise with the young lovers and the pure nature of their love that is only brought to tragedy by the relationship of the families. However, that's possibly a modern interpretation. If we look at Shakespeare's audience, they might well have taken a completely different view. And that view would look at the status of the families. They are landed gentry who between them seem to rule Verona. And it would be expected that parents of this kind of wealth and influence would marry their children wisely. And these would be financial and political alliances. And no one would have seen that as somehow denying the rights of the child. This would have been setting up Romeo and Juliet for the very brightest of futures, and indeed for future generations. And so seen in this light, Shakespeare's play can be read as an attack on teenage love. He deliberately makes the lovers so young in order to point out their immaturity, and perhaps to contrast that with the nurse's much more practical nature. And the nurse is looking after Juliet's long-term interests, but these are her temporal interests, her interests here on earth now. And you might look at Juliet and see her as a deeply religious figure who would not compromise her position in heaven by risking hell through bigamy. So lots to look at there that will easily get you the A star. There are some really interesting interpretations which you can look at here in your assessment. And so this writer thinks that the nurse is actually just obsessed with the sexual nature of Juliet's romance with Romeo, and is perhaps reliving her youth through that relationship, and merely sees Romeo as a sexual partner. And although the writer describes Romeo and Juliet's love as idealistic, he points out that the nurse herself can't understand it. The nurse doesn't share Juliet's idea of love. She sees it as something much more transitory, certainly nothing to give up anything for, least of all your life. And love is merely a way to a temporary and physical relationship. Again, this writer is determined to show that the nurse is fixated on sex and pleasure, a kind of hedonism. But the writer wants to contrast that with the intense and spiritual love that Romeo and Juliet share. And of course that's the complete opposite to that warning against teenage love that I suggested many of Shakespeare's audience might take from the play. This writer then looks at the nurse's words as kind of envious of Juliet's sexual pleasure. So I am the drudge, hard-working, old and past it in sexual terms, and I toil, in contrast to Juliet. She's toiling in Juliet's delight, and that's the sexual pleasure that Juliet is going to get as soon as she is married, which remember is the next day. And so the next night, and it's the night of course that the nurse focuses on, Juliet is going to have sexual fulfillment, at least in the nurse's eyes, although interestingly she's thinking both of childbirth and possible future pains when she talks about bearing the burden. And a final interpretation of that might be that it's a subtle allusion to the fact that it may well not be as pleasurable as Juliet thinks on the first occasion. And perhaps not on future occasions. Maybe that sexual pleasure is something that's expected by society, but isn't one necessarily that the nurse expects Juliet to enjoy. And whatever your answer, you're going to have to deal with this quotation here. I think it best you married with the county, and that's Paris, you'll remember, who is a far more powerful figure than Romeo. His family obviously controls the whole of this city, Paris, whereas Verona is split between two families. And so an alliance with him is going to be much more valuable to the family, and therefore to Juliet, than any alliance to Romeo. And Romeo's reference here as a dishclout doesn't necessarily show the nurse's ignorance. She chooses a household object which many people might think ridicules her. She doesn't have the breadth of understanding. But if you flip it the other way, actually she's taking a very practical view here. She's suggesting that Juliet should marry Paris. This is a far better alliance, and that's the job of marriage, securing the future. And Juliet can't see this. She can only see love. And here, the point is made more forcefully. He's a man of really noble birth. He is a gentleman. Perhaps a contrast to Romeo, who's still very much a child in the nurse's eyes. So this writer is very critical of the nurse's decision. He says she is ultimately subject to the whims of her society, and his use or her use of the word whims suggests how much contempt he has for that idea. However, this is not necessarily a whim from the nurse's point of view. This is the way her society runs, and it's what her role is built on. This is why she's brought Juliet up all this time. And of course, Juliet is not her mistress. Juliet's mother and father are her employers, and it's those she has to satisfy just as much as she needs to satisfy Juliet. And another way of looking at it is this. From the nurse's perspective, this advice here, to marry Paris, is actually the best advice she can give. It's securing a future in a secure family. And what does marriage to Romeo actually offer, if not tragedy? And this writer recognises that. He refers to the nurse's social position and points out that she's in the serving class, and that Juliet's parents are a more powerful influence over the nurse than Juliet herself, and she's not empowered to create change around her. She looks to the friar and is happy to follow him. He's a man of influence and a man of God, and if he's going to marry Romeo to Juliet, who is she to argue? However, once that plan goes wrong, she takes a very practical view. Now we might say, if she's maternal and taking the role of the mother, perhaps she ought to take more account of Juliet's feelings. And this writer just sees it as self-interest that she doesn't. The nurse retreats quickly into submission because of Capulet's anger, which is enraged. And in the Baz Luhrmann film, this, if you like, is the turning point that he uses to explain Lady Capulet's agreement to the marriage to Paris, and also the nurse's acquiescence. If we return once more to Schmoop, the writer takes quite a strong view of the nurse. He says she's both funny, but also disturbing. And she's disturbing because the nurse ultimately betrays Juliet. And he sees her advice to Juliet to marry Paris as a complete betrayal. And then asks this question: is the nurse responsible for Juliet's death? Maybe. Interesting idea. And she points out a production where when the prince comes on and says that everyone is going to be punished, a noose drops down in front of the nurse, and that she too might be punished. Although, of course, Shakespeare has no stage directions and doesn't make this explicit in any way. Do you think she deserves this kind of punishment? Well, the writer asks a question: why does she betray Juliet? And the first reason is that the nurse really believes everything she says when she tells Juliet to forget about Romeo. She actually believes that's the best advice. As this argument goes, the nurse simply does not understand that Juliet's love for Romeo is the real thing and not some childish infatuation. Well, that's one way of looking at it. But another way of looking at it is, even if the love is real, the nurse might think, well, that's not enough. You know, love doesn't last anyway. It is transitory. We're all in love for a short time, and then what we settle down to is a relationship in which a deeper love develops. And why should that relationship only develop from someone who's been in love? Why shouldn't it develop from a really well-arranged marriage. And that's not a modern view, but it's certainly one which the nurse could easily justify. He, however, doesn't take this view, or she doesn't, by pointing out her dirty-minded way of looking at love cannot comprehend a love like Juliet's. And this is a kind of class-based interpretation. The uneducated nurse, coming from the lower social orders, can't understand a pure and noble love like Juliet's. And I think the class system's leaking out into this interpretation. And if you look at the Baz Luhrmann interpretation, you can certainly argue that she's presented as a very working class figure. And that's part of the element of fun in the way that Mercutio mocks her and the way we're invited to see her. And what do you think of Luhrmann's portrayal? Is she presented as deliberately working class, self-serving, just looking out for her own interests? Is she manipulative? Is that what the colour red is all about in this scene? And of course, is she a traitor, a Judas figure? And then another way of looking at her behaviour is to point out that it's entirely selfish, and she does it purely because she wants to keep Juliet close to her in Verona, rather than fleeing off to Mantua, where Romeo's been banished. And of course the nurse would travel with Juliet to Paris's house. We can imagine an even better house than the one Juliet lives in. And so this writer clearly sees the nurse as in it for her own selfish reasons. She's not altruistic at all. However, he does introduce a counterpoint, and that is that Juliet is a woman who would not be able to survive alone in this time period if she is cast out by Capulet, and therefore she is actually looking after Juliet's best interests. And then he says it's important to note the nurse does stand up to Lord Capulet when he's yelling at his daughter, and this is a bold move because she could herself also be kicked out of the Capulet household. "You are to blame, my lord, to rate her so." And this is a very bold set of words to use in someone who's essentially a servant. Lord Capulet attacks her verbally and physically in the Baz Luhrmann version, and so the nurse gives up. In this interpretation, the nurse's praise of Paris is not sincere but helpless. In other words, she's just trying to make the best of a bad job. But I think a third possibility is there. She's actually weighing up what Paris offers compared to Romeo, and actually she makes a very good point about how much better a marriage with him would be despite Juliet's love. Indeed, it would be quite easy to suppose that the nurse thinks Romeo is going to be killed. That, after all, is Lady Capulet's intention. She says she's going to procure an assassin to poison him, and she knows that Romeo's life is short-lived, even if he is exiled. And so before looking at this scene in detail, you really have to make that decision for yourself as to what motivates the nurse and what kind of character she is. Once you've done that, we'll start looking at the language of the scene.